18th chapter of Matthew, we see that Jesus and his disciples were in Capernaum, and the disciples came to him and they asked Jesus, here in verse 1, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them, and he said, "Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like a child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever humbles himself like a child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." The interesting thing here is that when we think about humility, a lot of times we'll think about maybe a superstar athlete, let's say a football player who's busted through the line and he's ran 50 yards, throwing guys off and twisting and doing everything he's got to do to score the winning touchdown in the last 10 seconds of a football game. And he doesn't dance in the end zone. He doesn't cheer overly excessively. The crowd's going crazy and the team runs over and they lift him up, and then when the reporter gets there and he's talking to the reporter, he gives credit to the team, and he's not pointing at himself as being the greatest, and we call this guy humble. That's humility. Maybe we see it in a movie star who has made a whole bunch of movies and lots of money and won Oscars, and yet the actor or actress might seem really down to earth, and they might seem like they could be your neighbor, and we say, that's a humble person. That's humility. That's wonderful. Or maybe it's just your coworker who doesn't take all the credit for him or herself on a team project. He says, hey, we all worked on this as a team, and he gives credit to the others as is necessary. We say, there's humility. That's a humble person. The problem is, I'm a father of 2 boys, and when Jesus talks about childlike humility, that's not the humility that I see. You see, my youngest is 6 months old, and he's completely dependent upon his mom and myself and his brother and those around him to take care of him. There's no self in a very, very small child at 6 months. This is my oldest son. He is almost 4, and he is quite a bit more independent than my youngest. But still, there are some traits of humility, although it takes a little bit more to see it. See, the interesting thing about Asher is that when he's playing with friends and they do something really good, he wastes no time in taking credit for whatever that good might be. Maybe they clean the playroom. He doesn't even give his friends credit. But if something bad happens, he is really fast at blaming his friends. And this really doesn't look like that humble person in our office or that humble actor or star athlete. But the interesting thing is, I don't think that's what Jesus was getting at when he talked about humility, because there are things in children that don't look very humble. Asher wants to be the fastest and the best, and sometimes he says, hey, he's the strongest. It's just, it's just who he is, and it's part of his nature, and as he's becoming more and more independent, we see that more and more. But there's other things I do see in him when I watch him interact with his family, or if he's out playing and he doesn't think he can do something. We have a big rock out in our front yard, and last summer he was climbing up on it and he was getting up real high and jumping off of it, but he wouldn't do it on his own. He couldn't do it. He came to me and said, "Daddy, I can't do it. Come with me, because if you're there, I can do it." He had this thing where he could sense his own fear, and he dealt with it as a child does, but we don't see that a lot in adults. We see, well, I'm not sure if I can do this, but I'm certainly not going to admit that, and maybe I'll even try without getting help. We also see in children, and I see in my son quite a bit, a real faithfulness. When I read him stories from his Bible, he's got this big Bible here. He's got a couple of them, actually. And we open this up, and we read stories. He doesn't question, oh, is that a fish or a whale that swallowed up Jonah? He just believes it. His daddy believes it. The Bible says it's true, so he just believes it. See, the thing is, Asher just trusts his parents, and he believes us. When we tell him to do things, he does them. And when we tell him how the world works, he believes us. As he grows older, he's going to start engaging his own reason, and he's going to think through that. And maybe we're going to be wrong, and we're going to fail him. That's just the reality of being parents. We're finite beings. We're not perfect. But he still trusts us. So there's a lot of things that Asher likes to do, but he still depends on his mom and dad for help in those things, don't you? And he still listens to his mom and dad, and he still depends on his mom and dad, just like we need to depend on Jesus, just like we need to put our faith there and not in our own abilities and not in our own reasons, but in Jesus. And so that is what Jesus is, I believe, calling the disciples to.